So, welcome everyone to another episode of the As You Should podcast. My name is Michael Farrer, and I'm joined today by Francesca Humler, for whom I've written an introduction. I'm going to read now, but if there's any inaccuracies, please feel free to tell me. So, Francesca Humler is a German-American visual artist, photographer, and researcher, making diaristic and introspective bodies of work exploring topics including, but not limited to, nationality, identity, sexuality, religion, and mental health. The works are like an expansion of the medium of documentary photography, employing experimental techniques with archive, lighting, printing, still life, and surrealism. I could read one by one through the list of exhibitions, press features, and awards listed on her website, but I think it might take up the entire length of the recording. Francesca is joining me today to talk about herself and her journey into photography, as well as two of her projects titled Das Kuckucksei and Rituals. So thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for that introduction. I think it's really interesting to kind of hear the way that you see my work. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, great. No, so I think we'll start off just, tell me how you ended up in photography, because you actually have a bachelor's in science as well.
I
So
do, yes,
was that
in biochemistry.
was that an alternative path that you were considering before, or were you always sort of planning to come into photography?
I mean, it's kind of a combination of familial pressures and fear of not being financially secure that led me away from photography. I was always in love with photography in high school. I was introduced to it through the darkroom, and my dad has a PhD in physics, and there was a lot of kind of concerns around me being able to be independent as a photographer. And I was good at chemistry, and to be honest, I like chemistry. The thing I don't like about chemistry and the kind of pharmaceutical industry is the abusive nature of making medicine for profit. So I did actually work at a biochemistry company during COVID. And I was involved in testing COVID samples and developing COVID tests. And that actually paid for my master's degree in photography at the RCA. So in a way, it all kind of worked out in the end. But it's not something that I currently engage with, science
Uh,
at least.
Creatively, is there any crossover between science and photography in your practice now?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of people ask. I think, not directly, but in terms of the way that I was trained as a scientist, I think it definitely has influenced my photographic process in terms of how I research and how I create a photographic project. And I think it's influenced my like political beliefs a lot, my experience in science, which therefore inherently influenced my photography. So it's kind of an indirect influence.
There's quite a lot of religious symbolism. I mean, definitely in rituals, that's sort of a very sort of it seems to be a very intentional annihilation of faith itself. So, um, does your background in science have any effect on, how you're then representing religion in the photography, do you think?
Oh, that's interesting. The conservative Christianity, like that branch of Christianity that I was raised with, did a lot of things. It integrated my parents like seamlessly into the US when they got there from Germany. And I think I watched my father, who's a scientist, kind of grapple with how his beliefs in God compare with his scientific profession. I don't think that it had like as much of a direct influence in rituals, the scientific aspect, because I think I was more exploring like the social pressures and particularly the patriarchal influences of the church on my life as a woman. So I think it was more of like a gendered approach
Mm,
in rituals than anything else. But yeah, religion is one that flows over into every aspect of life, so it's kind of difficult to
mm.
continue.
I mean, it seems like and definitely in Das Kuckucksei as well, you seem to sort of create a metamorphosis of cultural symbols, and in some ways, um, in some ways they sort of seem like a partly like a trauma response, especially in rituals. You know, the image of, you know, what did the Virgin Mary do to deserve being strapped to the front of a van? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. Well, I think I I don't really say this very lightheartedly. I think photography saved me in a lot of ways. And before I even knew about the idea of like phototherapy and maybe like what Joe Spencer practice and all those things, it became second nature to process a lot of my like feelings and emotions through making imagery. And I started self-portraiture when I was really young. I was 13. I didn't even know like what it means to take a self-portrait, but I was doing it. Um, and so, yeah, it's a kind of a cathartic act, and I'm really into gesture, like what gesture can do and the relationship between objects. And a lot of my work is, like you mentioned, the image of the Virgin Mary strapped to the van. It's very heavy, obvious visual like symbolism, and I think I'm not one for subtlety.
Mm,
Um, but I get inspired by the objects I'm surrounded with, and a lot of the work I make is a response to the environment I'm in. So I was in a very Catholic place when I made that imagery, and it was a response to kind of like being inundated with this imagery of the Virgin everywhere you go, and kind of like that pressure of this is the ultimate woman, a woman that was a virgin, which is a lie because she had other children other than
mm.
Jesus, right? So yeah, I think that was like a direct reaction.
Yeah. And then with um the sort of more still life stuff. So I want to sort of look at Das Kuckucksei for a second. Um, you sort of create these metamorphosized sort of expansions of cultural symbols. So you have like the necklace made of Lebkuchen, the
Mhm.
potato replacing Jesus in the manger, and then the American flag on the rye bread as well. Is there some sort of cynicism to that, or is that just cross-cultural symbolism?
No, I definitely think I'm playing with irony and humor and cynicism, kind of a tongue-in-cheek. Especially those images, the ones that I present are sometimes like the softer gestures that I've made, and I often don't publish gestures which are more visceral, especially when it comes to, replacing Jesus in the manger. I don't want to like offend anyone.
Mm,
Um, but I also do kind of want to bring to light like how I don't know, a lot of these things that we do, right? Like setting up the scene of Jesus's birth under a Christmas tree at Christmas time. It's very performative, and I want to highlight the performativity of, everyday life, even the image where I'm wearing the Lebkuchen necklace and it's kind of melting against my neck. I want to show the performativity of culture and of femininity. And again, that was a very therapeutic image to take because when I was a kid, my mom would bring in those Christmas treats into the
mhm,
classroom. And then as we grew older, you grow up in school with the same kids for a while, and then we started learning about the Second World War, and everyone knew I was German because we would bring in those Christmas treats.
mm,
And that resulted in a lot of kind of bullying, especially because I have blue eyes, and when I was a kid, my hair was blonder. So yeah, like just acting out these kind of like memories from childhood, and then like maybe like reframing those things for myself,
mhm.
like re-owning like the marzipan Lebkuchen for
Yeah,
myself. Yeah.
yeah, it's one of my favorite snacks as well. It's great. So then as well, the print. So I talk about printing in your introduction. You're quite literally printing images onto people's bodies.
Mhm.
Well, firstly, like what's the process that goes into that, and what's the sort of personal significance of that for you?
Right. Yeah, so I think I did the most printing onto my own body in Chance or Family, that series. And that's something I developed while I was at the RCA, because a lot of my series, center my family. And so I would make work in California with my family or my extended family in Germany. And when I was in London at the RCA, I was kind of like lost. I didn't know how to engage with the facilities at the RCA, and especially because my first year was during COVID and I didn't feel that I got to use what maybe I was paying for at the RCA. I wandered into the printmaking lab during my second year, had an induction with Oscar, the print tech there, and I was just like, how can I use this to kind of embody what I feel my family photographs like represent, and I came upon this kind of idea that trauma manifests itself more in the body than in the archive, and I was looking for a really like obvious visual metaphor of how to show that. And so I told I told Oscar, I was like, can I print onto human skin using these like UV polymer plates? And he was like, look, I don't know. Those plates are meant to go through this press and have thousands of tons of pressure applied to them so that the paper goes into the ridges on the plate and you get a print. And I was like, well, I think I can do it. So I made some plates, I experimented on myself, and I started printing using a water-based printmaking ink onto my back. And turns out there's heavy metals in that ink.
Right.
So yeah, I would be sick for like days at a time afterwards. And then I realized, oh, maybe let's not use the printmaking ink. Let's use like costume makeup
Yeah.
face paint. Yeah, which doesn't make as clear of an image and it's far less beautiful. So sometimes I actually would still use the printmaking ink like knowingly because I wanted that really clear print of
Mm.
my family photos on my skin. But when I printed on my grandmother, I used the safe ink, so no one has to worry that
Okay, good.
I didn't poison Oma. She's
Uh,
fine.
she's all right.
Yeah.
She's okay. So when you're printing those images onto a human body and then rephotographing them, do you think it um almost becomes like a sculpture, the human body, instead of like calling it a traditional portrait, instead like it's almost like photographing a sculptural orchestration, as more of a I don't know how to describe it, as you would an object as opposed to a living breathing person, I suppose.
Definitely. And I think sometimes when I look through my images, kind of like zoomed out from bird's eye view, I realize how little faces I actually have in my imagery and how often it's someone turned away and kind of hidden. I hide myself a lot in my imagery. So that's definitely a theme or a motif. But I think I take what Charlotte Cotton talks about in her books, like tableau. I take that to a certain extreme, like the staged photography, and the use of it. And it's just, I don't know, it's what I gravitate towards naturally. And I have a 15-year background as a ballet dancer, and maybe somewhere along the way, dancing with the makeup and the staging and the costumes and the lights that might have influenced my kind of aesthetic desire because that was the earliest form of culture I was exposed to, essentially. Um, but yeah, it kind of happens naturally. I never really end up photographing a classic portrait.
Mm. How much interaction would you say you would have with your subjects?
Well, I usually so mostly the people that I've used in my practice are my family members or like my significant others, people I've been in intimate relationships with. So I'd say making work with them is really a conversation that happens over a period of time, beyond just the shoot. So for example, if we take that image of my grandmother where I've printed on her back, that happened one afternoon and I, you know, I would tell her this is kind of the idea that I have. But before that we take the picture, we would sit, we'd have a cup of tea, we would have a conversation, and it was kind of a way of getting closer to her. I grew up in the US and I wasn't around my grandparents very often. So this project was a way to like learn about them and their lives and what their connection to me is like what is my place in their life and in the family, especially as the oldest daughter. So that image, I learned that she, had to leave school and work in a factory when she was 16, which I didn't know before. So in a way, that series, I label a lot of those imagery, like images, as coming out of talk therapy sessions, in quotes. Obviously, I'm not a trained therapist, but I'd say that they were used as a way to talk about things we wouldn't normally have spoken about,
Mm.
and to just get to know one another better. So it's a mode of working that I want to expand now to people I don't know, strangers, and something I'm still developing. So.
I suppose it's part of where that phrase, that terminology, phototherapy, comes from. It's not one that I'm sort of massively familiar with. So can you tell me a bit more about what that
Mhm.
encompasses?
Definitely. I mean, phototherapy is something that I'm still kind of researching and engaging with, but it's ultimately something that I want to do like a PhD in. I'm quite serious about it, and because I've been engaging with like therapeutic ways of photographing since I was 13, I believe in its efficacy. Um but basically, I would describe it to someone who doesn't know anything about it by saying that it's essentially a practice of mindfulness, just like meditation or journaling. And it can be used to really like feel present in your physical form. So a lot of the times I struggle with, disassociation, and I will feel really just like a video game character going through my life on autopilot. But then I will take self-portraits, and the act of I usually don't use a proper method of taking self-portraits. Instead, I'm running back and forth between the camera and where I'm standing. And that like a- act of physical exhaustion and reposing and posing again really centers me in my body
Mm.
and connects me with myself in a way that I haven't found like other things do. So it's like something that I'm very much using for myself. Um, and of course, it's like a mode of like self-expression and recapturing a narrative about your physical body or like your identity and trying to make sense of the different things that have been maybe placed on you from other people. Um, yeah, I wrote my dissertation on it. So if anyone's interested, email me and I'll send you a copy of my dissertation. Yep.
I'd like to read it at some point. But it's, it is
Totally.
we've all been there. It's a very uncomfortable experience trying to take a self-portrait. Just not just like the actual like process of doing it, it's the like, oh my God, how am I going to look in front of the camera and trying to get through, the sort of the egotism of it as well as like trying to make yourself as conventionally attractive as possible in a photograph.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good way to really understand yourself as an artist. If
absolutely.
if you have a cohesive visual language that you're known for, it's quite easy to do that when you're photographing another person and you have control over everything, to then actually sit in front of your own lens and try and translate that into a self-portrait. It's a whole different dynamic, and I suppose you do learn a lot about yourself in that process.
Absolutely. I mean, you raise a really good point. I had a workshop participant recently, on a workshop I hosted on self-portraiture, ask me that, like, why do I feel the need to still remain conventionally attractive in the self-portraits I take? And it invites you to kind of like play with that and think through your own insecurities and also become vulnerable. I think a lot of people also ask me, how do you work up the courage to post images of yourself like semi-nude on the internet and things like that. And it's like the tip of the iceberg for me. It's like a certain staged vulnerability. It's not actually as vulnerable as people make it out to be.
Mm,
Like, in a way, to keep my own sanity and things, I have negotiated ethics with myself about what I'll go into publicly and what I won't. And I think people see me as a very like open practitioner and like willing to share. And yes, because my practice is personal, but at the same time, I have ground rules for myself, and I think I almost am doing it as a mode of protection. Like, people think they know me really well because they can see, oh, she struggled with ABC, but actually there's so much more going on. Do you know? It's
mm.
like it's a very like it's like a shell, the portraiture in a way, as when it's publicly presented. So you only know like 30% of what it's really doing for me, kind of thing.
Do you ever make anything that breaks that sort of that moral code that you discussed with yourself, but for the intention of not putting it anywhere and just keeping it exclusively for you?
Mhm. Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of imagery I have in my hard drives which no one's ever seen. Um, and I think the ones that I share publicly are maybe the ones that are intentionally more aesthetically successful than those that are more just for me. But that's also a learning curve. When I was younger, I didn't really understand that code of conduct, and that's something that I built for myself. When I my first self-portrait was shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego in 2017, there was like a huge backlash from my family and their extended friends about the nudity of the image, even though it didn't have my face in it. And like those experiences have really kind of shaped. And my little sister like cried when she saw the picture. Like it was very dramatic. And those things have shaped what I release now. So it's an ever evolving conversation, just like you would have with a subject you're photographing. Like the conversation around ethics is always like at the forefront
Mm.
and changing.
I think we're all guilty of it, is putting aesthetics over, artistic integrity first. But then I was listening to a podcast recently with the music producer Rick Rubin, and he said, for me, the audience comes last. Everything I'm doing is first and foremost for me. And, just progressing now as a creative, I'd love to now keep that in mind, because actually,
Hmm.
I've now stopped posting on Instagram and updating my website and my LinkedIn all the time, because it causes such a disconnect between, myself and the work I'm making. I have to love it. Otherwise, it's a burden, essentially.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think the further you get into your artistic career, I mean, I'm definitely still an emerging artist. Like um I still have a day job, but I think there's like a certain pressure, that comes through capitalism and the commercialization of work and the way that artists make their living. And you're always kind of you owe an answer not only to the like audience, but to the institution and to all these other places, and it can become quite confusing. Especially, I've heard from friends who have gallery representation, which is great and often means that your career is doing well, that they get pigeonholed, and they're not really making work for themselves anymore. And I think that's something that I'm still rebelling against. Like, maybe I need to own up to the fact that like being an artist and a photographer means making work that people like and can see your signature in. But it's still something I'm not super like comfortable with the idea of doing. And I'm like, no, well, this interests me right now about my family history, and I want to go down that rabbit hole. And I don't
Mm,
necessarily want to make imagery that looks like whatever project has been received best by people. And there's, lots of influences in terms of politics and trends that are always pressed onto artists. So I don't know, that's yeah, it's difficult to kind of navigate that, I think.
so are you avoiding commercial practice at all? Do you ever go into that area?
Well, I used to do a lot of commercial shoots and did weddings and grad shoots and things like that. I never really broke into like fashion photography or product photography. It was for a while my aspiration when I was an undergrad. Um, but I think the more that I understood about myself as an artist, and the more I understood like that my photographic practice has such an intimate relationship with like my own mental health and those things, I've become a bit more protective around it. Like I think I really would like to strive to take images that satisfy like a certain need within myself. And I'll do other things as my day job, social media management, those things. I'll help out other artists, community management, teaching, but there's a certain protective layer now around photography for me, like the actual act of making an image.
So what comes next then? So do you these projects that we've talked about, do you feel as if they are resolved, or do you still feel a need to return to them and expand them?
Mhm. Well, I'd say with the cuckoo's egg, I think this project may have to be resolved for now, just because my grandfather passed away in August, and I think I need to maybe like walk away from that a bit and
Mm,
just like have some space from it. In general, I want to move away from working with my family as much, and maybe explore like broader themes, like I said, with people beyond my immediate social network that have cropped up in my work. So I'm working on developing a project kind of around that, and I'm looking for funding, because I it's gonna take a while to develop that project, so I really want to do it properly and not rushed. I don't see rituals as resolved at all. I think my conversation around faith and the way that Christianity has impacted my life is ongoing, and I can see myself adding to that project throughout like the next 5 years. Um, but I'm not sure if like resolving projects is really the goal. I don't know. Um, I think I have a lot of imagery also that falls outside of projects and is kind of waiting to be categorized. So yeah, just have to see where it goes.
yeah, that sounds exciting. So I think so. What there's a question which I think I'm going to start asking um everyone that I interview, and I think that is, so are there any writers, theorists, philosophers, or any works of literature that have sort of inspired you along the way, or have had you returning to them, when you're in need of answers?
Right. Oh man. Well, everything and anything that Joe Spence has written. I went to the Women in Revolt show at Tate Britain, and it was one of the first times that I really was able to get up close and personal with one of her writings that's integrated into like her collage practice. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh God, I'm more similar to her than I even thought before, which was kind of like maybe concerning. I don't know, because her life was quite like, you know, stressful.
Mm,
So that one, and also Marianne Hirsch, with the concept of post memory. I mean, there's so many. I think like reading and researching is something that I'm always fighting to have more time to do, if that makes sense, but I'm getting more into kind of academic, like sociology papers, like with statistics and like number-led um social theory at the moment, and maybe less so into writing about photography directly, just because I think I need to like arm myself with the knowledge around those trends that I've seen within my own life and within my communities, and make sure that I like fact check them and back them up and don't
mm,
just go based off of a feeling when I'm involving other people. Because obviously you can go based off of a feeling with your own life and your own family because you have that authority to do so. To an extent, you still need to research, obviously. But yeah, I think that's kind of like where I'm going. So I'm floating a bit away from the art writing right now.
yeah, I think that's the right thing to do. I think, not just as photographers, but as creatives in general. it's best to be sort of as widely read as possible to, you know, go in and out of the subject as much as possible. Yeah,
Hmm.
I read science journalism, so I've absolutely no science background. I've absolutely no clue, but it's just interesting. And
It is. And yeah, like having access to those things is really important because I think a lot of industries become so insular and then they hide research and things like that behind paywalls, which I absolutely like disagree with. I think,
yeah,
everyone should be able to access science papers. Like you shouldn't have to pay for
yeah.
that. Yeah.
What are you reading at the moment?
So I just picked up the new issue from Granta magazine on Deutschland. I think it's their issue 83. Just started it. Wow. Firstly, the writing is just brilliant. I mean, like the introduction to the issue itself kind of knocked me out. But I think from a historical perspective, I'm learning a lot about Germany. Like I think Germanness and all of that is something that's always something I'm looking at in my practice. Um, and just trying to, connect with that identity that I hold, but not really at the same time, as is always pointed out to me by people.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, that's what I'm into right now.
yeah, I like that sort of idea of trying to, reconnect with a part of your identity that you never really had. So my background is very Eastern European, very heavily Polish, but I never feel Polish.
Hmm.
Um, I've never even been there, but at the same time, I sort of think of it as, some other part of the world that is very much heavily a part of me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like that feeling, is something that's so prevalent within like German culture itself, just inherently because of the history, that kind of like disconnected, um, not really like a sense of like that American pride is so innate.
Mm,
And it's interesting to connect with a culture that doesn't necessarily have that. Because then I think people in that culture are constantly questioning why you even want to do that.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I mean, it seems like, when a lot of Americans seem to be very, very proud of their culture, and they could have never, oh, I'm this much Irish and this much German or this much Spanish, but so many of them have never even been to these places, but they won't ever say, oh, I'm American. It's I'm Irish or I'm German.
Yeah.
They seem to avoid saying anything but, I'm American.
I mean, growing up, it was so funny. Like, I would, meet people and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm German." I'm like, "Really? Like, we can speak German together?" And they'd be like,
Du
"Oh, no, no,
sprechen
no.
Sie Deutsch? Nein.
My great great grandmother, whatever." So I was like, "Oh,
Yeah,
that's different, from."
yeah,
But I think the first time I really was ever kind of forced into identifying as American was living in the UK.
right.
Um, I can't run away from my accent, basically. So that's been a really interesting experience. It's reshaped a lot of my like attitudes and thoughts around the United States. I mean, I've been living here for 3 years. So it's been, yeah, different.
Are you starting to now feel more, more European and more in touch with that side of yourself now that you're sort of now on the same continent and around not the same culture, but a similar, I don't know how similar it is really, but like more
Yeah,
European culture.
I think so. I mean, when I first moved here, I showed a Paris photo and my German was not where it is now. And being able to, quickly travel to Europe, and I've done much more traveling within Europe since I've moved here. I've been fortunate enough to do so. It's like really increased my language skills. I think before I was so isolated. in California, and my parents largely refused to speak German with me, which is a whole can of worms in itself. Um, but I was listening to German podcasts like while I was at work in California and just like desperately trying to keep it up. And here it's a lot easier to do that. Like
Mm,
obviously I'm in the UK, so people speak English, but like theoretically, I can, even just like I can go to Lidl down the street, can
yeah.
buy some like I can buy some sauerkraut and can make like things that my grandma would make and can go visit my grandma. Those are things I didn't have really as a kid, that accessibility. It's because the US is far away.
Mm, yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we will call it there. So I hope you've had
Great.
the chance to speak about everything you wanted to today. And thank you very much for coming on. To everyone watching, please go and visit Francesca's website, have a look at her work, read some of her essays. Like she said, if you want to read her dissertation, drop her an email.
Yes.
Um, and we will see you again when you're making, more work, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you, Michael.
Okay,
Thanks for
brilliant. It was a pleasure. Right.